covered in The Origin of Species, Chapter 7 of Coins, Why Evolution is True. In 1928, a German zoologist named Ernst Mayr traveled to New Guinea to find new species of birds. When he went there, he saw that the natives recognized 136 different types of birds. By traditional methods of Western taxonomy, we recognize 137. What this means is that even local natives and Western scientists recognized the same species of birds. This means that the differences in nature in animals is not just some arbitrary idea, it's a fact. This can also be seen in big cats. While we can look at big cats and say that they are all big cats, we can differentiate between the different types of big cats, just as we can differentiate between the different types of birds. Without the discontinuity involved in speciation, we would just see the blurring of lines between species. We would see only one species that just has adapted over time rather than branching out into different species. Species used to be separated purely by their outer appearance. This is called the morphological species concept. This is the way that we would group birds into a group or tigers into a group, just saying that they all share certain morphological traits, such as tigers having stripes. Maybe they're different colors, but the patterns of stripes would be similar, so we would group those all up into one category. However, one of the problems with that is that in dimorphic species, you can have males and females of the same species. They can look very different from each other, even to the extent that you wouldn't even be able to tell that they belong to the same species in the first place. The biggest example of this would be peacocks. A male peacock's plumage is designed in a way that they can attract their female counterparts to mate. And females, they don't have this large, colorful plumage due to the fact that this is a morphological difference between the two genders within the species. When you look at different ethnicities of humans, you can see that there's differences in eye color and other morphological traits. However, they're all still part of the same species. And the most important reason why is because they can all reproduce with each other and create viable, healthy offspring. A species is therefore based on its differences in appearance, behavior, or physiology that prevents them from successfully interbreeding with members of other species. So what this means is that species are reproductively isolated. Even if some species are able to reproduce with each other, two different species are able to reproduce with each other and create hybrid offspring, in most cases, those hybrid offspring would be either sterile or would have a very high mortality rate and are essentially not present in nature. Now, one theory for how divergent selection occurs is by the formation of some kind of geographic isolation of a species. And one example of this would be the theory for how monkey flowers diverged. So we could say that this species of flower, we'll say that there are two populations and that they were separated by the formation of a mountain range. On one end, you have a high amount of hummingbirds, low amount of bees, and due to the high amount of hummingbirds, the flowers are most likely to be pollinated by hummingbirds. Due to this, flowers would be selected for having long flowers and a high amount of nectar to facilitate the pollination by hummingbirds. And we'll say that the other population has an environment with a high amount of bees and a low amount of hummingbirds. So that means that the flowers would be selected for having low amounts of nectar, because bees they do not require a high amount of nectar to be drawn to the flower, and they would also be selected for having a landing platform for the bee, because in the other population no landing platform would be necessary, because hummingbirds don't need to land on the flower to pollinate it. And so if the mountain range was eliminated and we had these two different populations, we would now have two completely different species of plants that would not be able to interbreed and are two different species.
Selection that drives different populations in different evolutionary directions is defined as divergent selection. This divergence eventually leads to reproductive barriers which prevent interbreeding between the different populations, which is what we define as speciation. Geographic isolation is just one way that this occurs, but there are other ways. For instance, different mutations affecting male behaviors or traits could appear in different places. These mutations could affect color, tail length, or other features that may cause their mates to prefer them. If two recently diverged populations later encounter each other, their mating preferences would prevent their genes from mixing. Therefore, they would be considered a new species. If these two populations have continued to diverge for a long enough period of time, and then later come into contact, their genomes could be so different that if they do happen to mate, the combination of their genes will not work and the hybrid either dies prematurely or becomes sterile. Contrary to Darwin's ideas, species do not arise to fill ecological niches. Rather, they are evolutionary accidents. Populations which change genetically via natural selection are much like languages which change by linguistic drift and selection. Languages, like species, occur in discrete groups rather than a continuum. Languages diverge to the point where they become mutually unintelligible, just as populations diverge genetically to the point that their members don't identify each other as mates. We can take this a step further. The evolution of languages can be traced back to the distant past and a tree drawn up based on their relationships. This is the same idea as the phylogenetic tree, which maps out organisms' evolutionary relationships. Using these trees and other resources, biologists can predict missing links in ancestral lineages, much like reconstructing proto-languages. These analogies were first realized by none other than Charles Darwin. Simply stated, the evolution of genetic isolation between populations requires that they first be geographically isolated. This is because if a single population is ever going to split into two isolated parts, it will be very difficult if interbreeding remains possible. Even if selection is trying to drive the populations apart, the interbreeding will constantly mix their genes and oppose divergence. If you have two populations that differ in their ability to tolerate two different plants' toxins, but they continue to interbreed, you'll most likely end up with a generalist that uses both plants. But now, let's say the populations are geographically separate. Starting with one ancestor, it takes approximately 100,000 to 5 million years to evolve two reproductively isolated descendants. If speciation takes this long, and there are approximately 10 million species on Earth today, geographic isolation must be common. Relative to the history of life, it is. From continental drift and rising mountain ranges to the formation of glaciers and deserts, even rivers can act as geographic barriers. But in addition to these, there is accidental dispersal, which happens, for example, when a bird or few birds fly to a nearby island and start a new population. As you can see, there have been many opportunities for isolation, but has there been enough time for all these species to form? Remember that the number of species has grown exponentially from the very first common ancestor. With this in mind, let's assume that there have been about 100 million species to ever walk the earth, and the common ancestor was approximately 3.5 billion years ago. On average, each species could theoretically take 200 million years to differentiate into two species in order to arrive at 100 million today. In order to test if reproductive barriers are the byproduct of evolutionary change, biologists forced model organisms to adapt to different environments. After many generations, usually dozens, unlike the thousands that occur in nature, they are reintroduced to each other. Shockingly, these brief experiments often yield reproductive barriers, verifying this assumption. This leads to the second prediction of geographic isolation. If populations must be isolated to speciate, then the most recently formed species should be found nearby. The Isthmus of Panama is the perfect example. Here, we find 7 species of snapping shrimp, but each species' closest relative is found on the opposite side of the isthmus. This is continually proven with various species, such as Drosophila on the Hawaiian Islands and orchids found in different regions of South Africa. Finally, this brings us to the final prediction. Reproductive isolation between physically isolated populations increases slowly with time. Again, using Drosophila as the model, Coyne and Alan Orr measured 3 reproductive barriers: mating discrimination and sterility and inviability of their hybrids. They concluded that after approximately 2.7 million years, genetic barriers became strong enough to completely prevent interbreeding.
Evolutionists accept physical barriers between populations is the most common way species are divided. But can a species which diverge live in the same geographic location? It is extremely hard, considering interbreeding will neutralize any attempt at speciation, but it is possible. Sympatric speciation is the process by which a new species evolves from a single ancestral species while occupying the same geographic location. What is a way to prove sympatric speciation? Well, we can look at isolated areas of terrain or water, which are small, to prevent geographic barriers, and see if there are any speciation happening. 2 examples of these are cichlid fish and palm trees on Lord Howe Island. 2 lakes in Cameroon are within a volcanic crater. They are small, not allowing populations to spread far. With these restrictions, we still see many species of cichlid fish, one lake with 11 species and the other with 9. The other case is palm trees on an oceanic island called Lord Howe. The island is small, 5 square miles, and it contains 2 native species which happen to be each other's relatives. Because the palm's pollen travels very far, geographic isolation as a reason for this speciation is invalid. There are 2 types of special forms of sympatric speciation that are common in plants. One of them allopolyploid speciation and the other autopolyploid speciation. These two types of speciation allow us to see speciation in action, so to speak. Allopolyploid speciation is interesting in that it starts with two different species that live in the same area that produce a hybrid that is viably fertile. A hybrid between species will undergo proper pairing of chromosomes, which makes the hybrid effectively sterile. But if you double every chromosome in the hybrid, each chromosome would have a partner, and the hybrid will be fertile and a new species. Autopolyploidy, on the other hand, does not need two species but only one, which has all its chromosomes doubled. This results in a new species. Polyploid speciation differs from other types of speciation because it involves changes in chromosome number rather than changes in genes themselves. To get auto or allopolyploidy speciation, you need the formation of sperm and eggs which have a high number of chromosomes. These two types of speciation are in fact not rare. It is estimated a quarter of all species of flowering plants were formed by a polyploidy.